Okay, China,
Oh boy.
what's happening over there, and why shouldn't we all be investing in the Chinese stock market at this point?
Well, you do with your money what you want to. Let's see. When we spoke last, it was about 8 months ago. Does that sound right?
Sounds about right.
Okay. So at that point, it was literally a week before the new demographic data came out. And so at the time that you and I were speaking with Ian Bremmer, China was already the fastest aging society in the world and had the third or fourth fastest aging workforce ever recorded of any time. And they were on path to seeing their workforce cease to exist as a functional unit within a decade. Less than a week later, the data was updated, and they were then reporting that their their number of fresh births year on year had dropped by more as a percentage of their population than what had happened to the Jews of Europe during the Holocaust since 2017, which, there's no historical analog for that at all. And in the last month, they've updated the data again to indicate that they may have still overcounted the number of births that they've had in the last 5 years, because the number of kids that are enrolling in kindergarten is sharply lower than what they were expecting just 12 months ago. So we are seeing a country that is not in demographic decay, but is in the advanced stages of irreversible demographic collapse. And they are now literally running out of people in their late 40s already. And this is not even the worst case scenario. That is, what's his name? Yu Fishuan, I believe. I'm probably mispronounced that. Apologies. But he's a Chinese demographer who thinks that the overcount in the Chinese population is probably about 250 million people. We are looking at nothing short of a civilizational collapse over the course of the next 15 years. I would not invest in the stock market.
And how would you expect them to behave in the meanwhile? From the CCP on down.
Yeah, if I was going to use air quotes and a normal country, there might be any number of policy prescriptions that you could try to at least buy some more time or deflect this a little bit. But Chairman Xi has so inoculated the system. He's purged so thoroughly that there's no one left. Decision-making capacity within the government has almost fallen to zero. He's established himself as the sole decision maker, but he's also penalized the transfer of information. So the bureaucracy has responded to this by not even collecting data anymore, much less transmitting it. And so we're seeing policy collapses across the length and the breadth of the entire system that is really confusing the business community because they're not used to seeing this at the same time, and that you get a crackdown on the business community for being the only part of the system where there's, some thought and planning going on. This is not the recipe for something that's going to last a decade. The Chinese are almost itching, it seems, to find their way to state failure as quickly as possible. I don't mean that they're doing that on purpose, but I mean they're sabotaging their own government in honor of the cult of personality.
It seems that much of the foreign policy establishment has not gotten this particular memo, and I still hear China routinely described as the other superpower, the emerging one, and the question is whether we're going to fall into some Thucydides trap with them.
Sure.
Graham Allison wrote a book by that title.
No, in defense of Graham, real quick, he did point out that only happens half the times. The Thucydides trap is not something that happens every time there's a transfer of power or a rise of a new power. It happens about half the time. In addition, the Chinese rise was largely because of the American-led globalized order. And they are actually more dependent upon that now than they were before. So if there were a war, the Chinese would not just lose it, they would lose it so thoroughly, they would have a deindustrialization collapse complete with a famine in a very short period of time.
So what are you expecting with them to do with respect to Taiwan?
That's an open question. If the Russians succeed with what they want to do in Ukraine and Poland and Romania and the rest, they actually do buy themselves a lot of time. They get in a much better strategic position, and they will probably persist till the very end of this century. I think that's a realistic possibility.
How do they buy themselves time demographically? I mean, don't they suffer the same demographic collapse or by absorbing those countries?
The demographic situation is still problematic. Don't mean to suggest it's going to get better. But by being able to plug their military access points, they can focus most of the manpower that they have remaining on maintaining civil control. And if there's one thing the Russians know how to do, it's how to put down a protest. If they don't have to worry about the exterior power, they can worry about the interior elements. And they are, unfortunately, quite good at that. China doesn't have something like that. There's no place that China can go. There's no land they can occupy. There's no resource that they can secure that heads off their problems. They are the world's largest importer of almost every raw commodity, foods included. They import 80% of the stuff they need to grow their own food, and they're the world's largest food importer. They need a globalized system, healthy, vibrant, functional, and made safe by someone else. If they launch a war, they lose access to all of that overnight. So a war, even in Taiwan, that conquers the entire place without a shot, conquers Tokyo without a shot, Manila, Jakarta, all of it. Take the entire first island chain. Everyone just accedes. It's still not enough. They need full access to the entire globe for both consumption and production. And that's not going to be in the cards ever. So
if you're betting on famine in China.
You mean if I'm betting on famine again in China?
Yeah, you have a very different picture of America's future, although I'm not sure how sanguine it is, given the fact that we may be experiencing a nuclear winter, which will not observe any political borders.
That would suck.
Yeah. Just how rosy is your picture of life in America, given what you've said about the prospects of failing to avoid a nuclear war, which is really more or less everyone's assumption about the future?
Fair enough. China, I think, is going to ultimately descend into a disintegration where it falls apart in its own juices. I think the challenge of the China disintegration is going to be largely one of replacing the industrial plant that's necessary somewhere else in the world, in North America, before we lose all the Chinese stuff. And that's a bit of a race. And I'm actually been fairly optimistic at how fast the American business community has moved. In the last 5 years, we've seen industrial construction spending more than quadruple in the United States. And in the electronic space, it's increased by a factor of 10. Now, we need more. We need more. But that's a good start. The Russian situation, assuming for the moment that we can help the Ukrainians engineer the death of the Russian military on the plains of eastern and southern Ukraine, then that problem becomes one of a second Russian disintegration. And I don't mean to suggest there won't be a lot to manage there, but that will probably, fingers crossed, keep the Russian disintegration wrapped up within the borders of today's Russian Federation as non-Russian ethnic groups rise up, as they have in the past, attempt to control their own destinies. And the groups to follow most closely are the Tatars and the Bashkirs, who are Turkic descendant groups, kind of like the Chechens, but much more sophisticated, much more technologically commanding, and sitting on the most important infrastructure within the Russian Federation. They control the cluster of pipes and power lines and roads and rail that connect all of Siberia to European Russia. And if the Russians lose that, that takes most of the oil patrimony overnight. And I think that's the most likely outcome over the course of the next 20 years, assuming the Russians don't proceed past Ukraine. That's ultimately a part of the long-term problem that the Russians have identified as justifying the war in the first place. So they can focus on keeping those peoples down. It's not a stupid plan. It's simply a dangerous one. Assuming
given that that's what success looks like, the disintegration of Russia without starting a nuclear war with the West, now, Russia becomes an even scarier, by a factor of 1,000 version of North Korea, and with lots of loose nukes to worry about. What, if anything, can anyone do about that? I mean, the prospect of loose nukes under a complete disintegration of Russia is pretty terrifying.
Well, let me point out two things. Number one, we've been here already. This basically happened in the 1990s. You had de facto independence movements in a number of the Russian republics, including in Tatarstan. And we almost got to this point. Second, the loose nukes question, unfortunately, is a series of unknowns stacked on top of a series of even more unknowns. But consider the state of the Russian military the first month of the war and how badly it did and how badly the equipment performed, even if it was in the hands of supposedly soldiers who knew what they were doing. We have no idea what the status of the Russian nuclear arsenal is. We do know that everything that the defense minister has touched has suffered. Shoigu has easily stolen 1/3 of the defense budget in Russia personally, and probably another third by his cronies. That includes the nuclear arsenal. It's entirely possible. And I think this is the Biden administration's nightmare scenario here, that the Putin government hits the red button and nothing happens. What do you do when someone attempts to nuke you and fails? Because they're going to like rip apart the panel and try to hit that big red button again. What's your plan for that? But what that suggests to me is every day that passes where a nuke doesn't fly is a day where those weapons degrade a little bit more. And I'm not suggesting that we're not setting ourselves up for the next major security crisis. That's absolutely in the cards here. But spinning down an old nuke in order to re-up its punch requires facilities that exist in very few parts of the world, in really just 7 countries. So if you were to give a random dude an old nuke, it's not like he can blow up a city, probably. And I realize it's a probably on a maybe. It's not something I spend too much time being overly stressed about, because at the moment, the strategic nukes are in the silos and controlled by a major power. And they are far more dangerous there today than they would be 15 years from now in some random dude's hands.